Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I was asked to do this talk about my family. Well, I thought, what in the world is interesting about that? And then which line of my family we're going to deal with. My family never throws anything away. Well, that's a blessing and a curse because that's really the reason that I'm here today. Some of my family lines have been in Augusta a long time. And there's a little chart of those. I'm going to talk about some from the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and maybe about two from the 2000s. And I'll tell you about people who are not the most famous people, or not even very well known particularly, but they are examples of various aspects of the overall story of Augusta, which is, I think, what my charge is to this project. I put a label on each one of these that they might not be totally accurate, but some of them are merchants, some of them were soldiers and professionals, some of them farmers, and some lawyers, and then some other things mixed in with that. And we'll begin with herds. This is my fifth great-grand uncle. He really was, so I'm not really descended from him, but he was so-called governor of Georgia before the revolution was completed. And there's a big story about him. Maybe it's fable, maybe not. But he was imprisoned by the British in Fort Cornwallis here in Augusta, right over across the street, basically, at St. Paul's Church. And he was released from there because of a family slave named Mammy Kate. And Mammy Kate was from the Stephen Hurd place, which is now in Elbert County, called Hurdmont. And she allegedly made friends with the British folks and did laundry for them. And then she came in there and was managed to get Governor Hurd, who's a very small man, and smuggled him out in the laundry basket on the top of her head. Well, it says on her gravestone there on the left, it says there, you can't read it, but it says February 14th, 1779. Well, Fort Cornwallis wasn't built yet at that time, for one thing, and that was supposedly where Governor Hurd was captured at the Battle of Kettle Creek up in Wilkes County, which occurred on that very date, February 14th of that 1779. But the Patriots won that battle, and usually the people that win get prisoners instead of the other way around. And not only that, the British were occupying Augusta at the time, but they retreated to Savannah on the very same day. So it's probably unlikely that story is true, but like all stories like that, they might have a little kernel of truth in there somewhere, and maybe somebody will figure out the real story before it's over. He went away on his horse Silver Heels, which is pictured over here on the left. And in 1935, my father played the role of Governor Hurd in a pageant that the city had to celebrate its 200th birthday, 1935. Well, that was actually, they got it in the wrong year because it was actually its 199th birthday then. And my father, at 12 years old, who was a horseman, he rode Silver Heels out of the municipal stadium, and Augusta didn't know it was the wrong year, but they sure did have a good time, I think, while they were doing it. Now we're going to skip ahead a few generations, and this is Stephen Hurd also. And he had a D in his Stephen D. Hurd, and there were so many Stephen Hurds in Georgia at the time. The story goes in my family that the D didn't stand for anything, it just to distinguish him from the rest of them. Well, it turns out my genealogical whiz sister figured out that's not true. It actually was Doss, but it was never written down in our family history. He married Mary Willis of Wilkes County. I don't have a picture of her. That's her tombstone right there. He was politically connected. He was a senator, former sheriff, signer of the Ordinance of Secession, January 19th, 1861 for Georgia. And there's a copy of one of the original copies of that. I brought it with me. It's on the table. You can look at it there. A printed copy which was contemporaneous with that. But having a politically connected father-in-law meant that he got an early appointment as postmaster of Thomaston, Georgia. He moved over to Talbotton, Georgia, which was on the western frontier. At Talbotton, he was practiced law there. That's the sign of his office there on the left. And then below that is a certificate where he was admitted to practice law in the Supreme Court of Georgia, with the first 5 or 6 lawyers that were, because it was established in 1846 in Talbotton, Georgia. Why, I couldn't possibly tell you that, but he ended up moving to Augusta, didn't practice law here, but he became a cotton merchant and cotton factor. There's commission merchants and warehouse merchants here, and was pretty successful at that. He had 3 children. We're going to talk about them in a minute. They're up on the right. And he was elected to the city council of Augusta. He thought it was a good idea to have a watchtower to look for fires. And he convinced the city council to build this tower right here, 110 feet high at the intersection of 8th Street and Green. And that tower or the bell was called Big Steve. We're not sure whether it's the bell or the tower or both. And it was in service until the electric warning systems came around about 1887. And a couple of years after that was built the first paid fire department for Augusta. They were all volunteers before that. And that's this building right here, 1892, which is actually my office down on 8th Street now. So we ushered in with Big Steve, and we took him down too, all in the family. All right, so the son. This is Willis Hurd on the left, and he married a lady named Anna Platt. And Anna Platt was the daughter of Charles A. Platt, who was a northern merchant from New York and Connecticut, moved to Augusta and started a company in 1836, furniture company, and undertaker on Broad Street. And that is Platt's Funeral Home, still in business today. And that turns out to be a pretty good thing for her. S.D. Hurd took his son in with him into the cotton business, and here's their advertisement in the newspaper, but it included some things there that turned out to be a bad thing, and that is cotton futures. They invested in that and sort of got caught up in the cotton panic of 1873, as it was called here in Augusta, but actually it was global. That was the Depression of 1873. A lot of places over the country, the business has invested in risky things going forward, and then everything crashed, and 89 railroads went out of business, 18,000 businesses in the United States went out of business, and S.D. Hurd and Son Cotton Factors was one of those. Probably doomed because they invested in futures of cotton elsewhere. At any rate, they declared bankruptcy in 1875, and there's their notice in bankruptcy. That was a humiliation for Stephen Hurd. He said that his word had always been his bond, and he pretty well died a broken man about a year later. Well, Hurd's son Willis also died a couple of years later, and he left a widow, Anna Platt, Anna Platt Hurd, and she had 3 small children to rear, and so she opened her house. This is it, 3 Oaks. It was on Hickman Road, just about where Oak Hill Apartments, maybe they're not called that now anymore, but at any rate, and she took in boarders. And she took in boarders which included a bunch of northern people because of her father's connections to New York and what have you. And we've been able to discover, is rather interesting, that is really the beginning of the Yankee tourist business in Augusta that went on in that winter colony for 50 years. So I have a piece coming out in the magazine for Augusta Historical Society in a month or two. It tells the whole story, so I won't go into that right now. But look for that. It was sort of revealing to me. I didn't know it. In fact, nobody knew it. But we, with some help from Leanne Caldwell and Eric Montgomery, I think we got the story kind of straight. Working for the Platts was also William Jefferson White, and he's pictured over here. He was a black man. He was could pass for white, actually, and he was the pastor of Harmony Baptist Church, but he also started the Augusta Baptist Institute, which has revolved into the famous Morehouse College today, which was founded here in Augusta, and he was the instigator of that. But he was dispatched as a carpenter from C.A. Platt and Company to the house of Stephen D. Hurd to repair a stairway. Well, when he got there to repair a stairway, he met Josephine Thomas, whom he married. And so they had a family together, and that was a connection pretty well. Also, going back for a moment to two other things, at Three Oaks, Mrs. Hurd employed Albert Taylor as a hostler. Well, I didn't know what that was. I had to look it up. Hostler is a handler of horses and mules, particularly related to a hotel or an inn. And there he is with Swayback. And we'll get back a little bit to him later on. Now, Charles A. Platt, one other thing about him, I'm not directly related to him, but he came here as a Yankee, but he was in the militia here. He was an officer, basically in the local Confederate militia. He was a colonel, and he used Catherine. This is my Vanna White here. She's going to do show and tell. He led a procession at the funeral of Bishop General Leonidas Polk, 1864, and using that baton right there. And that baton, or leading staff, is sort of symbolic, comes from the Romans, basically, or the fasces, and they used to beat back the crowd so the high muckety mucks could get through. And so that baton was used a lot. It was used by him to lead that procession, but it was also used by William Gould in 1844 to bring Henry Clay, who was running for president at the time. He came to Augusta and stayed with his relative, Emily Tubman. It was also used by J.C.C. Black. We'll get to him in a few minutes, for unveiling the Confederate Soldiers Memorial on Broad Street. And finally, it was used on Confederate Memorial Day, 1887. Okay, the next is Emmy Dompierre Hurd. She is pictured here on the left, and that's the second child of those Hurds we talked about, S.D. Hurds. He married Isaac Thomas Hurd, this is confusing because as far as they knew, they weren't related to each other. But it turns out with modern genealogy, they were about fourth cousins. So if anybody is named Hurd, I'm probably related to them through one way or another. If she was their daughter, my grandmother here, Catherine Hurd, was an interesting person in that she was one of the first women drivers in Augusta. She had a Model T Ford that her father had bought for her. But if you know about cars, they're very difficult to crank up because they didn't have electric starter. You had to crank it with a crank. So she has told me that she would go down on Broad Street, and when she got ready to go somewhere, she would find a nice strapping man around there and pay him a little bit to crank the car for her. She said, though, told me, when I was young, everybody was in the cotton business, especially in the fall when the cotton came in. The rest of the year, they did something else. Well, that's sort of true in this case because her father obviously was a cotton factor. Her brother was a cotton factor. Her uncle, that is. Her father was, the rest of the year, when he wasn't a cotton weigher, he was an insurance agent for Penn Mutual Life Insurance Company, and he had an office in what was the Masonic building on Broad Street, although it's not there anymore. Mitchell Tyler, who was the sexton of St. Paul's Church, remembered those days. He said you could walk on top of cotton bales from St. Paul's west for blocks and blocks without ever touching the ground. I.T. Hurd met his end in a sort of terrible way. He got run over by a streetcar on Broad Street, and he was killed instantly, but fearing being sued, I think the streetcar company was quick to point out that in his little briefcase or case that he had with him had a bottle of whiskey in there. Well, was that happenstance or was it the cause? Well, we don't really know about that either. S.D. Hurd's other daughter, here, Anna Hurd, she married J.C.C. Black. And J.C.C. Black was sort of an interesting guy. He was called Major Black, but he wasn't a real major. And there were a lot of people in that time that were either colonels or majors or something as some title of respect. He was actually a private, and he was a private in the cavalry guard that was guarding Jefferson Davis at the end of the Civil War as they fled away from Richmond at the end of the war. He ended up with a sheaf of Confederate money, $500 bills for the 1864 printing. I still have some of them. Catherine has some, and interestingly, the serial numbers of them are sequential. So they actually have never been spent, and it probably would take about a wheelbarrow load of those to buy a loaf of bread at that time, I think. But he had a parole to come to Augusta and said he liked the place, went back to Kentucky, and, you know, being in the Confederate Army in Kentucky was sort of questionable because there was a lot of people on both sides of those issues. So he came back and he ended up marrying Anna. Well, was he chasing a skirt or did he just like Augusta? I don't really know. But he ended up being a lawyer and first president of the Augusta Bar Association for 39 years. He was a really wordy orator, pompous sounding. I've read some of it. Put you to sleep pretty good. He ran against Tom Watson, a populist from Thompson, for Congress and was elected twice, 1892 and 1894. And there were some questions about the election. That's a whole nother story that you might need to find, or maybe I need to find out more about it. Okay, let's kind of switch over. These are Robertsons, and all these, sort of a military theme here. They all began as officers, but as the generations came down, the rank of them kind of came down too. But I don't have a picture of him, but the progenitor that I know of is Lieutenant John Robertson. He was a member of the Virginia Continental Line in the Continental Army. He was a lieutenant, the adjutant of one of the regiments there under George Washington. And that meant he knew how to read and write, so we're kind of glad of that. He was captured at Charleston and exchanged, and was from Winter Park, Virginia. He had several children, and he got some bounty lands after the war because the Continental Army didn't have any way to pay anybody. So they paid him in land, but the officers got a lot of land. He got 3,000 or 4,000 acres, mostly in Kentucky. But William Robertson, from whom I'm descended, was a younger child. So he, under primogeniture, he wasn't going to get anything. So he got out of there, basically. And he came down to Augusta, not Augusta, near Augusta, to Abbeville with his future wife and her family, Pamela Mosley. He was a civil engineer and a surveyor. Don't know how he got his education on that, but he got a commission to make a map of Abbeville District, which he did in 1817, and it was published in Mill's Atlas of South Carolina in 1820, which had maps of all the districts of counties at that time. He lost his job somewhere along the way in 1823. I'm not quite sure how that is. But he picked up and came down to Hamburg, South Carolina, went to work for Henry Schultz over across the river here, and he surveyed the lots that were being added on to the town of Hamburg. in 1823, and this is the plat of it right here. It's not his plat, but it was one that was made later in 1835 when Hamburg was sort of bankrupt at the time, and the state took it over for non-payment of loans. At any rate, Henry Schultz didn't pay William Robertson either. And and as a surveyor, I can tell you some things don't ever change about that. But he ended up moving over to Augusta. Was an agent for a while with the steamboat company on the river, but ultimately he joined the South Carolina Railroad as its first superintendent of transportation after its first civil engineer, Horatio Allen, retired. Well, he had to live in Aiken for that, and his son, we'll get to in a minute, but Francis Marion Robertson built him this house right here, and that house is, the Aiken people call that the Legree Morgan House. Well, it's actually the Robertson Legree Morgan House, because if they'd gone to Barnwell County to look at the records rather than, see, Aiken County wasn't even invented until 1871. So at any rate, if they looked a little further, they'd have found out how it was really built. At any rate, it had to be real near a place in the railroad which was pretty strategic. And that is, if this map, if you can see it, this is Charleston, this is Hamburg, and that's Aiken. And this line and that line went over ground that was pretty flat. But when it got to Aiken, it was like this. And so rather than trying to figure out how to make it longer, they just made a ramp, basically, or an inclined plane. It was operated by a steam engine, and they winched the trains up and down this. And that thing has been recently rediscovered by archaeologists in Aiken in the last 4 or 5 years. And Aiken has produced this, which is a replica of it. It's not exactly on the same site, but I have not seen that. I didn't even know it existed. So I'll go over there and look. Howard Waite, who's an aficionado of the railroad, sent me that picture. Emily Tubman, we talked about her a little while ago. She liberated 42 of her slaves in 1837 and paid their ways back to Africa, where they colonized the West African country of Liberia. Well, they were fearful of being re-enslaved if they were taken to Savannah to be put on a ship to go over there. So she entrusted them to William Robertson, Jr. to accompany them on the railroad down there and put them on the ship General Pinckney in care of a preacher who took them back to Africa. Well, the Tubmans became leaders of West Africa. In fact, they had a grip on it, probably too strong of a grip, because they lived an extravagant lifestyle and amongst conditions of poverty. And maybe you all have seen that in the news, the ruins of some of these mansions that the Tubmans built there. Well, William and Pamela had 6 children, and 2 of those were named for famous people. One of those was named Francis Marion Robertson, who is my direct ancestor, and we'll get to him in a minute. He had no connection or relation to the swamp fox of the Revolution. He was just named for a famous person. And also another one of their children was Lewis Ford, Lewis Ford Robertson was named for the mayor at that time, and also one of the founders of the medical college. Incidentally, the descendants in Charleston of Lewis, whom I've lost track of until somewhat recently, were in the cotton export business there, and they ended up moving, some of them moved to Europe. And his further descendant is Ursula von der Leyen, who is the current president of the European Commission, that is the executive branch of the European Union today, for whatever difference that makes. Now, here's Francis Marion. There he is up there. We got a couple of pictures of him. He was called a field marshal because of his military bearing and the coincidence of his initials. He attended West Point, but did not graduate. Actually, John C. Calhoun, who's a neighbor in Abbeville, appointed him to West Point, but I think he didn't do very well in French. And you might ask, why did that make any difference? Well, almost all the military books at that time were written in French, so that might have been a little handicap. He did graduate from the Medical College of South Carolina and wrote a paper on remittent fever. And remittent fever is fever that comes and goes, and it's either malaria or yellow fever or sometimes both. He was the captain of the Richmond Blues because he was a West Pointer. I guess he got those days the militia captains were elected by the soldiers, and the city council paid for their way to go down and fight in the Seminole War. This is a picture of the departure of the volunteers. That's a printer's proof. It's probably a mirror image, but that belongs to the museum here. They went down into Florida, marched around for about 3 months, and then came back home. His wife, however, there she is, right there, Henrietta. Henrietta did not share her husband's zeal for military service. In fact, as he left to go down there, he left her with a 1-week-old child here in a city that she was not that familiar with because she was originally from Charleston. He wrote a lot of letters back and forth well, actually not back and forth. He wrote her a lot of letters, which we don't have her replies. But at the very end of that time, in April of 1836, he writes, "Oh, my dearest, how I will rejoice to embrace you once again. May God protect you and my dear little ones and bring us together again. I wish you to return to the Planters Hotel before my return home. Yes, I am so excited. Sometimes I feel as though I could take wings and fly immediately to you." Well, what is he asking her to do? I don't know. That's kind of weird. Francis Marion was also did not believe that yellow fever was contagious. And as a medical doctor, he took some of the black vomit and put it in a capsule and ate it to prove it. And he didn't die. And then he and some other doctors wrote a paper in 1839 about a terrible yellow fever epidemic here in Augusta. And there it is right there. But they concluded, not knowing about germs and viruses and things in those days, that there were miasmas or bad air that had come off the pile of garbage that was dumped in the river at the garbage wharf. Well, I didn't know it, but the way they did that, they had a big ramp and they dumped all the trash and garbage from the city in the river and waited for a flood to come along and wash it all away. Well, of course, they didn't realize, and I mean, it was a long time before the early 1900s when the experiments of Lazier and Reed and so forth in Cuba proved that it was spread by mosquitoes instead. Well, he and Henrietta moved to Charleston for whatever reason. That was her hometown. And ultimately, they had 5 sons, all of whom served in Confederate service. And they named at least 3 of them after famous people. We're getting the theme here. Henry Clay, the presidential candidate, and the Clay-Webster debate guy. James Lawrence, from whom I've descended, from Don't Give Up the Ship. And Duncan Clinch, who was the general that was over the whole army down in the Seminole Indian War. Well, here they are in about 1870, and there's Henrietta again. I kind of think she looks like she could play in the Salvation Army band. FM was, or Francis, as he was sometimes called, was a surgeon in the Confederate Army. He was too old to be there for field service, so he was on the board of medical examiners for the Army that screened doctors for admission into the service. Well, he kept a daily journal at the end of the war, after the evacuation of Charleston, and he covered 900 miles through 4 states, writing every day, and that was right before, or with General Hardee's army, right before the footsteps of Sherman right behind him up through South Carolina and North Carolina, ending up in the surrender at near Durham, North Carolina. At any rate, he writes as he left Charleston, I left Charleston with my servant Henry Sutcliffe on Thursday the 16th and reached Florence at 9 o'clock that night. Finding it impossible to get to Columbia, I remained at Florence until Friday the 17th and telegraphed General Hardee and communicated with the Surgeon General by mail. Well, on that same day, Columbia was already being bombarded by Sherman's army that very day, so obviously he couldn't go where he was supposed to go. General Hardee was the army with whom he was attached, but he reported directly to the Surgeon General. In fact, all medical officers didn't report to the commander where they were. That seems very inefficient from those days to report to somebody 400 miles away, but that was the way it was. Henry Sutcliffe, I think it's Sutcliffe, was probably a slave or perhaps a freed black man, about 25 years old. And it was very unusual among African-American slaves in that he had both a given name and a surname. Well, maybe it wasn't so unusual after all. My friend and historian here in Augusta, engineer and former city engineer, A.B. Ladson, says that's not so. So all slaves had surnames, even though they weren't written in the books that were kept by white people. He says, contrary to that standard mantra of professional historians, the reason that freed slaves most often did not take the names of their last master, and it wasn't that they were so angry about being enslaved. What it really meant was they already had surnames. They had surnames that came from the time the family unit was formed, not at the date of emancipation. And the names typically have come down in the female line. He says he can prove it with his own family tree and has made a spreadsheet of it. And he's probably right. I asked him what he was going to do with that information. He said he's going to write a book, but he hadn't written it yet. So I'm stealing his thunder maybe a little now. But you can see the same pattern in Dave Drake, the famous potter from Edgefield, exactly because Drake was not his master, but Drake was two owners back up their line. And Albert Taylor, that hostler that we've already met, is the same way. Catherine was able to trace his family back to the 1830s in Hancock County, Georgia. Every generation named Taylor in the female line. So with that little diversion, we can talk a little bit about Jimmy. Here's Jimmy right here. That's James Lawrence. Francis Marion ran into him on this trip in Greensboro, North Carolina, in a railroad station there with his leg shot up, and took sort of care of him in a cart on the way back to Augusta. He had been shot a few days earlier in Averysboro, North Carolina. And you can see here the surgeon's instruments, and you can't really see it, but the main thing right on top there is a saw. Well, the saw is what they cut the legs off with if they had bad circulation. But the story goes that some family cousins from Wilmington named Derazette intervened with the surgeon and saved Jimmy's leg. So we don't know the whole story about that, but we'll come back to him a little later. Francis Marion, Catherine, you got duty here. I forgot, I went over this. This is stick number 2. Stick number 2 is right here. This is the head of it, and this is Fort Sumter, South Carolina, when the flagstaff that was shot away during the bombardment. They made a lot of, whoever they are, made a lot of souvenirs there in Charleston, and one of those is, Catherine's holding it up right there. This stick, it says on the top of it, well, it says Flagstaff of Fort Sumter shot away during the bombardment, April 13th, 1861, one day after the bombardment started. And he kept that thing for quite a while. General Beauregard had a similar one with a gold cap on it. Those are the only two I've ever actually heard of, and that kind of came down in the family junk that we have and kept up. At any rate, right at the end of the war, and when Jefferson Davis was retreating from Richmond, we talked about that a few minutes ago, he had supper in this house right here, which is a bank. That was the Bank of the state of Georgia in the branch in Washington, Georgia. And the cashier of that bank was a medical doctor, John Joseph Robertson. That's F.M. Robertson's brother. Well, we don't know how he got from being a medical doctor to being cashier of a bank, but nevertheless, he had a sumptuous meal for Jefferson Davis. And when the house was being torn down some years later, that was one of the balusters of the staircase was saved as a souvenir of that. And that sort of passed down in my family too. So we ended up have one souvenir from the very beginning of the war and one from the very end. And Jefferson Davis was supposedly bringing the Confederate gold through there at that time, but nobody's ever been able to find it. And Bob Young can tell you all you need to know about that. Okay, now we're going to get to the grandson of FM, Jimmy's son, Wright and Robertson. He was married to Catherine Hurd, the woman driver we talked about. There she is again, a little more grown up. And when I was a little boy, I asked my grandfather, "Papa, why do you have tails in your closet?" Well, the answer was, so I could go to the White House. Why would you go to the White House? He attended a full dress reception there about 1910 when he was in medical school in Maryland. And when Taft was the president, thanks to an invitation from his second cousin, Archie Butt. And Archibald Butt here is sort of a famous figure here in Augusta. The bridge we have is named for him. Went down on the Titanic and so forth. And President Taft sent condolences to the Robertson relatives after the Titanic sinking in April of 1912. And there's Taft's memorial, and then this is a cover letter from the secretary in the White House. It was written to Wright and Robertson, but it wasn't written to this same Wright and Robertson because he had a first cousin that had the same name. But I usually don't tell anybody that. And then here he is, starting his military career, Wright and Robertson, a cadet lieutenant at Richmond Academy. He became a lieutenant in the medical corps going to World War I, and kept his diary and letters to his mother, which we have that are in Augusta University Library. But here's the whole medical corps from Georgia taking training at Camp Greenleaf right before they went overseas in the Expeditionary Forces. That was somewhere near Chattanooga. He's in third from the left, about the third row, and my uncle told me you can tell by the ears sticking out which one he is. Pretty obvious. And here he is with my father at the Bonaire Stable, which on Heckle Street. And you can see this building right here behind. That's the stable. That's still there. It was the Board of Education offices there, and it's now been converted to apartments, but that's still there. And we'll see some more horses too. My father was, there he is right there. He's a private. See, we're going downhill here. He ended up graduating from Sewanee in 3 years because he knew he was going to get drafted. So he got out of college and ended up getting drafted. It didn't get drafted. He enlisted in, believe it or not, the Horse Cavalry. Now, I didn't even know the Horse Cavalry was existing at that time. But he went to Fort Riley, Kansas, and here he is right here. And he pretty well lucked out there because the cavalry was disbanded while he was there. And he volunteered. You're not supposed to volunteer for anything in the Army, but he did and volunteered there to shut the base down. And his sergeant got him in the Signal Corps instead of the infantry to go overseas. He also sent a bunch of letters home. So he and his father did too. But my father's letters we still have, and he and his mother got around the censorship of the Army by this book. It's called France Will Live Again. They called it the Castle Book, and it was written between the two world wars, and they would talk about what page number things were on, and my grandmother could tell where he was. Well, I've never read these letters. I have them. There's 2-3 boxes of them. It's a big job. Maybe Catherine will do that one of these days. But his father, I'm going to go back for a moment to World War I. He wrote a lot of letters home and kept a journal. And being a urologist and a medical doctor, he probably had to cure a lot of venereal disease there in France, I think. And you got to remember that sulfur was the main drug they used, and penicillin hadn't been discovered yet. But he wrote from France in 1918. I'm sorry to hear that Augusta is still in the grip of the Spanish flu, and it gives me some concern for fear some of you will have it. Hope you are careful to obey every caution in guarding against paying particular attention and not being in crowded, poorly ventilated rooms where people cough and sneeze without covering their nose and mouth, infecting everyone around them. Now, does that sound familiar to the COVID era? Sort of does to me. And then finally in this, I include me. That's a cadet lieutenant and Helen Bailey, my sponsor at Richmond Academy. That was our annual. I didn't serve in the military. I ended the whole line of this thing. I ended up being in ROTC at Georgia Tech, and I ended up being subject to the draft, and I had draft number 100, and they called through 95, so I didn't go to Vietnam. Maybe I'm not too proud of all that, but here we are. So, okay, now we're going to talk about Millers, mostly from the Beach Island area. That's Jonathan Miller. We'll get to him in a minute. But Captain John Miller was his father. He lived at a place called Blueberry Hill in Beach Island, had about a 1,000-acre farm there. And if you go to Beach Island today, you'll see where they're constructing this enormous addition to Kimberly Clark, and they're doing all kind of grading over there. Well, that's where it was. But he threatened a lot of family members and other people, and ended up getting committed to the insane asylum in Colombia. So his son Jonathan ended up being the family leader. There were a bunch of children there, and they fussed with one another over the land. And I guess they got past that. Jonathan Miller married Margaret Smith Miller. Here she is, right up here. And they had 12 children. Well, what did they do for the Augusta area and the Southeast? Well, they populated it. Well, there are tons of relatives around. Their diaspora, that's a new word for me this week. I didn't know what that meant. But scattered through all around with southern cities and towns. And some of my Miller cousins I just met today came from Macon to hear what I had to say. At any rate, here's where we're going to get back to Jimmy. Their daughter Catherine married James Lawrence Robertson, who was an accountant. He was the treasurer of the Langley Mill, and he worked for Tom Barrett there. I don't think he liked his boss too much, but that's okay. It made him a living. They enjoyed other things, though. The Millers and Robertson had a tea party at this house on Bay Street, and it was pretty close to some other Barretts that lived either next door or pretty close. They did enjoy parties. Jonathan Miller lived to be 101 and a half years old, and which was really unusual at that time. And here is his birthday party right here from 1910. That house is on Green Street, right about where the Church of the Resurrection Lutheran Church is, about where their Sunday school building is. Not there now. And when I gave a talk about my book about Albert, I'll talk about that in a second, one of the Miller relatives brought this little box right here, and it was, can you believe it? We don't ever throw anything away. Is it? That's a piece of the birthday cake from over 100 years before, and and Crystal decided to make a birthday cake for the downstairs, and maybe you got a piece of it. It's not 100 years old or 200 years old, but they got confused, though, that they even put the wrong name on the top of the box. It says James Miller, but it's not James Miller. It's Jonathan Miller. This is Araminta Taylor. This is the mother of Albert Taylor, the same Albert Taylor who we saw with Sway back before. And she was a slave that belonged to the Millers in Beach Island. And at emancipation, she stayed on with the family for 30 years after that. And Albert stayed in Beach Island for 5 until he got married and moved to the Hill in Augusta. But Albert Taylor was a very interesting person because in the family, we didn't know their last name, but we were able to figure that out. And it goes back to this Hancock County business. Albert Taylor was a very interesting person. He was an entrepreneur. He basically did a lot of stuff, but he ended up financially being here. And Jonathan Miller, his former master, was like this. They switched positions, basically. And he had a lot more money than Jonathan did when he died. He founded Elam Baptist Church, which is on Mount Auburn Street. You can see that there today. And we got all this information, and it seemed like an awful good story. And so I wrote it down, and Richmond County Historical Society published it. And Catherine, my genealogical whiz, found living descendants of Albert Taylor's family. And all that family moved north in the Great Migration, so there were none in the South anymore. But the 3 of those descendants came to my book launch in 2017, and they called it a reunion. It was a very moving experience, I'll say. And here they are, pictured as a group on my front porch. And so we keep up with them through Facebook and Christmas cards and all kind of stuff. Pretty interesting situation. Okay, now we're going to come to Barrett's. And the woods are full of Barretts in Augusta, and there's some in the room here who are my cousins and distant cousins, and I can't remember how we're related exactly, but there are lots of us around. And the ones that they are descended from are probably not on this chart, but this chart's a little small. And I'll start with W.H. Barrett, druggist. And you got, well, off the internet, Catherine found this bottle right here. I think the museum has some of this too. I thought that was interesting that says W.H. Barrett on the side, but it was, and we also have found, this was internet for sure. This is an advertisement for Hill's Hepatic Panacea. Well, Hill's, and the side of that bottle says HHP on the side of it. So it actually was in there. We didn't know that until yesterday. At any rate, Hill's Hepatic Panacea, or liver medicine, a guaranteed cure for all liver complaints, dyspepsia, and headaches. So, well, maybe we don't believe that. He and Susan Rind had a son, and that's William Hale Barrett, son of Hale. He went by Will. In 1886, he was, at age 20, the principal of the Sibley Central School on Telfair Street that had students from the factory district around the Augusta factory at that time. He married Ella Carson Barnes, and there she is. And Ella was the daughter of George T. Barnes. George T. Barnes was a congressman for 3 terms, 1885 up to 1891. They lived on Green Street. In fact, their house is still there, right at the base of the Calhoun Expressway. He lost re-election in 1890 to Tom Watson, and he let J.C.C. Black take over from there. But he was a Democrat, and here he is right here, cartoon from Congress, and you can see he was very rotund, weighed about over 300 pounds. The story was he couldn't reach around his pants to unbutton his pants, but whether that's true or not, don't know. Miss Ella, as her obituary called her, was described as a philanthropist. The grief of no persons could be more poignant than the unfortunate of this city, white and colored, the impoverished, the sick, the heavy laden, whom she had assisted so generously for so many years. Well, Will was a lawyer, and he was in partnership with James M. Hull at the beginning of the present Hull Barrett law firm, although it was called Barrett and Hull at that time. He represented a lot of prominent clients, including railroad companies, specifically the Georgia and Florida Railroad Company, since its beginning. He lost his house, which is there, his house, his church, and his office in the fire in 1916. And that fire burned 32 city blocks, 138 acres, destroying 526 residences and 138 businesses. Well, Will Barrett called a meeting the next day at the courthouse to appoint a new committee on public welfare, which he presided over. They raised $50,000 to give aid to 250 destitute and homeless citizens, and that was the white committee. He worked hand in hand with the colored committee on public welfare, which was chaired by Silas X. Floyd, who was the pastor of Tabernacle Baptist Church as its chairman, and the Dr. C.T. Walker as its spokesman. Speaking at Thankful Baptist Church, Barrett concluded his talk by saying, "Truth is in being, not in seeming, not in dreaming of some great things to do, but in doing some little good every day." Well, the surprise gift came his way by his friends and people that were appreciative of him. They had a meeting, and it was like a surprise birthday party, and they called him in there to it. And they gave him this centerpiece. It's a flower arranging dish, sterling silver, and it says, presented to, this was the inscription on the tray, presented to William H. Barrett by his many friends in Augusta, Georgia, in appreciation of his distinguished service as chairman of the Committee of Public Welfare after the conflagration of March 22nd, 1916. Mr. Barrett rose to, this is written in the paper, rose to give his thanks, and beyond a simple "I thank you" uttered falteringly, he was unable to express his words in appreciation. Well, there's the centerpiece, the tray with the inscription. Probably one of my cousins has it. They didn't know they go together, I guess. Got separated. Well, Will Barrett was ultimately appointed as a federal judge for the Southern District of Georgia by President Warren Harding in 1922. Harding was a Republican, and there weren't many Republicans in the South at that time. He was very popular in life, even though he is listed as the worst president that we've ever had. Not sure that's entirely true, but the reputation of his administration and the problems that were uncovered, were uncovered after his death. And there was a lot of corruption and what have you. At any rate, Will Barrett was a reluctant candidate for judge. Some railroad union officers in Washington thought he was antagonistic to railroad employees. Barrett wrote to his legal colleague, Paul Stevens, who was a former Augustan, who was an in-house legal counsel for the International Brotherhood of Trainmen, railroad trainmen in Washington, about being considered. He said, "I tremendously appreciate your thought of me in this connection and your offer to do what you can do to serve me. And I thank you sincerely. But in all frankness, I do not think there is any but the most remote chance." Well, at the end of a whole long string of letters, Paul Stevens writes back after the appointment was made. "Now that your appointment has been confirmed by the Senate, I wish to explain what I meant in my last letter relative to bread cast upon the waters. I'll carry your mind back 22 or 23 years ago when you were building your home on the Jones lot on Broad Street. When the house was nearly completed, the contractor left a lot of paint and brushes around in the kitchen area, and a small boy gained access to the house and painted up the kitchen, which necessitated the finishing of the work all over again. The contractor wished to prosecute the young boy and have him sent to the reformatory, but you, in the kindness of your heart, interceded and told the contractor to go ahead and refinish the work and send the bill to you. Well, it goes on a little bit further. Well, Judge, I was that little boy. Now, I can't read it because it's emotional, but a copy of the whole letter is on the back of the handout here if you'd like to have it. The two horses in the Barrett horse scene, I think, are the same horses at the Bonaire stable that were in the other one that you saw. At any rate, Will Barrett's daughter-in-law, Tito Barrett, joked he was appointed, but he thought he was anointed. Will and Ella had one son, George Barnes Barrett. George married Tito Barrett, Baker actually. He was 32 and she was 20. He was the first president of the Kiwanis Club, and he was kind of maybe an old bachelor. She came to be a speaker at one of the meetings there. She was the president of the class at Tubman High School. She must have made an impression on the members there, and certainly on him. Was he a cradle robber? I don't know. He almost lost out and stood her up for a date, and it turns out it was for the dinner for President Warren Harding at the Partridge Inn, and he was about 2 hours late picking her up. And I think I guess she got over that, I suppose. At any rate, George Barrett ended up being a lawyer with his father's firm, and by this time it was Hull, Barrett, Willingham, and Towle. In the World War II, Barrett edited and published a kind of homemade typescript newspaper that went to Augustans going overseas with a small group, and then it grew after that. He had been trying to get in the Army, but is rejected because of poor eyesight. And the first of those old home news things began this way. My friends, all branches of the military service seem thoroughly content to go along without any assistance from me. After they started the whacks and the waves, I had hopes. But old nearsighted lawyers don't seem to be useful for anything other than soap making. Well, it lasted for about eight issues, and he suddenly died after having walked home from work downtown to the Hill, 4 miles or thereabout, along with some other men who apparently did that pretty often because there were very few automobiles in those days, and gasoline was rationed, so I guess that was what you're supposed to do. At any rate, that short-lived old home news provided a window in Augusta while the community and its citizens prepared for war. Local events in that brief period were not only representative of the extraordinary national war effort, but were the seeds and precursors of many changes that occurred in Augusta, including right after that, the downfall of the Cracker Party, which is recounted in these papers. George and Tito Barrett's descendants have provided 3 more lawyers in successive generations at Hull Barrett, one time or another. William Hale Barrett, called Hale, his granddaughter Susan Dupree Barrett, and his great-grandson George Gostin Robertson. Well, we've looked at real people, some real history, some facts, some fiction, some bits of truth, and some bits of trivia. And I hope these little snippets of real people and real events that happened in Augusta's past, each in a small window of its own time, will be useful to you. Probably giving you way too much information, and I see Nancy is about to get the hook out over here. I do have a handout here that has some sources of written material about some of the things I've talked about, and on the back's the small boy letter, if you would like to have it. You can send me an email if you like, if you have questions. My contact and website information are on the screen, along with Crystal told me I had to put that QR code on there so you can use your phone, you can turn it back on now. And as an unapologetic capitalist, you can buy one of my books, which are right here. Thank you. Hey, you can come and look at the stuff up here. Thank you.